Are the UCI losing control over professional racing? A few years ago, the answer would have been a resounding no. But I'm starting to think that might not actually be the case. Now, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, more specifically when it comes to bike and equipment regulations, because there have been a number of examples where riders, teams, brands, and even competition authorities have gone against the UCI. So, what does this mean for the future? And when it comes to creating new rules or changes to existing regulations, what is the process that takes place? Well, in this video, I'm going to speak to an industry expert to help me understand more. Now, before we get into this, I want to make one thing very clear. While it might feel easy to criticize the UCI, they do have a tough job on their hands. For example, they need to make racing as safe as possible, but still exciting to watch. They also need to allow for technical progression, but also retain the history and heritage of our sport, so racing in the Tour de France doesn't end up looking like this. Now, the UCI should have a pretty damn good idea about the history of cycling, seeing as it was formed way back in 1900. 14th of April to be precise, 125 years ago. It was established by the National Cycling Federations of Belgium, France, Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. The UCI replaced what was known as the International Cycling Association, or ICA, which had been formed in 1892, and the UCI became the undisputed governing body of cycling as recognised by the International Olympic Committee. Now, as the world governing body, it's the UCI's job to oversee all aspects of our sport, and while they do have a lot of control, they're not simply left to their own devices to do what they like. There are breakaway groups and organisations like SAFER, the WFSGI, WADA, the IOC, national governing bodies, the ASO, Velo, the CPA, professional teams, and of course, as of recently, national competition authorities who can all get involved and throw a spanner in the works. Now, over the 125 years that the UCI have existed, there have been plenty of examples when riders and the UCI have clashed. You can go back as far as 1933, when the hour record was broken using a recumbent bike compared to a traditional upright one. A year after this, the UCI redefined what counted as a legal bike permitted for racing, with specifics on components and geometry. Now, this is actually regarded as the first example of the UCI banning certain equipment. Now, there are, of course, far more recent examples too, when the UCI has flexed their power, most notable being the Women's Tour of Romandy, when 5 teams were excluded from the race for refusing to take part in the UCI GPS tracker trial. Now, the idea behind this was to try to help improve rider safety, or the time when an entire cycling team had to borrow shoes and pedals at the start of the race because the UCI decided that their new setup didn't meet their regulations. Now, what really kind of got me thinking about this subject much further and deeper was the latest batch of technical regulation updates from the UCI. Things like limiting wheel rim heights, banning certain helmets, limiting handlebar dimensions, and of course, that court ruling by the Belgian Competition Authority, which essentially put a stop to the UCI's proposed gear restriction test, which was due to take place a few months ago. Now, this is actually one of the very few times, if not the only time, that I can think of when the UCI faced legal action limiting their power. So, a few months ago, when some of these regulations were still up in the air, I spoke with Mark van der Molen, the managing director of FSA and Vision USA, to understand more about the steps involved when the UCI want to change or update their technical regulations. We discussed the early phases of product development, what organisations speak to who, and how all of this impacts pro racers, amateur riders, and of course, the supply chain of products to consumers. Can you give me an idea of how this process would first start in terms of design, approval, and production?
Yeah, so we'll, looking at the product ideas might be coming, using like the Pro Tour as an example, like we might be getting some product feedback from riders on the tour, some of the teams that we work with looking for, a new handlebar design or looking for, something to optimize aerodynamics with a handlebar. We'll use that as an example. It could be anywhere from like a 12 to an 18-month process, depending on what that is. That takes into account like the lead times for production, You want to have ample time for ride testing. You want to have ample time for, lab testing to make sure everything's validated and safe and meets all both our internal standards and external standards. So just kind of like an overview of how we would kind of manage some of that development process.
So where within that would the area that involves, say, the UCI regulations and making sure that you meet those, I guess that's done pretty early on to make sure products fits the criteria you need it to.
Especially within the design parameters, looking to see, what are the regulations, what are the, say, dimensional regulations that we have to work with, for handlebar shapes, what is it physically, how wide can it be? How narrow can it be? What do those airfoil shapes need to be confined to? Obviously, we're also, UCI is looking at, that we'd be passing like safety standard testing, which we do anyways, because we're testing for all of that before we would even go into prototype phases. So, from our side, looking at what the UCI rules are would be very, very early on, because you're kind of designing with that in mind, and obviously the handlebar itself is not, it's not isolated. You've got interface with shifters, you've got interface with computers, you've got to, attach that on the bike. The cables and hoses and wiring needs to go somewhere as well. And I mean, within the industry, we're part of the WFSGI, which is the World Federation of Sporting Goods Industry. So instead of the industry having 100 individual voices, we've got one voice. We meet with this group on a regular basis. There's different working groups within the WFSGI. They're working with all of us in the industry to kind of interface with the UCI to have a kind of a single unified voice that we collectively have provided them with details and things like that. We have been to some degree looped in on some of the proposed changes. And while the industry has offered its insight as to what the suggestions are on those changes, knowing from our work both on the product itself, but also with the teams and the athletes, and understanding what the timelines are, some of those have been offered to the UCI, some of those have been considered, some of those had not. So a lot of the times, yes, the industry is aware of what some of those changes might be, or the timelines associated with them, and in some cases, the industry has not been involved.
How would you rank the timeline that's proposed and available to manufacturers versus what manufacturers would perhaps deem to be ideal in terms of their processes and preparations? Because the 1st of January 2026 is not actually that far away. No,
it's not. And that I think the industry in general, considering the timelines that were involved and originally suggested, I think January 1st, 2027 was much more preferred. That gave the industry, the teams, the suppliers, everybody involved a little bit of time to adapt, make changes if needed. Still working under kind of that 18-month timeline. If you look at, say here we are today, end of July. Looking at how could we adapt to what that timeline is, but January of 26 really it's unachievable to make any changes in the time frame, to consider kind of what rule changes would be. Now, in the case of FSA and Vision, and we'll use handlebars again as an example. We make handlebars that would be legal within the guidelines with proper installation, say, of the shifters. And we're talking specifically about the handlebar widths, both inner and outer. And so while we make handlebars that are within the guidelines of what the UCI has proposed, the teams and the riders, especially on the Pro Tour where these rules really apply the most, they're not really using those sizes. For the bike manufacturers, even harder because their specs are set much, much further out in advance. But in our case, if we want to develop something, a new handlebar or a new wheel set, we're really kind of waiting to see what the UCI rules might be, because we can't go too far down the development timeline, knowing that those rules might change again. And so right now, a lot of the industry is taking a wait and see approach.
What does that mean for, say, an end consumer that isn't a pro level racer? Will these products gradually vanish from their availability? Will you guys continue to still make these products available for the mass market, or how do you foresee this evolving?
I think I think that people are eventually going to kind of settle down into using what they like, using the product that's going to perform best for them. You are correct that there's a tiny sliver of the global population that really has to abide by the UCI rules. However, people do want to see the product that they're using used at the most competitive levels. I think where we will continue to see product, let's use handlebars again as an example. I think with really narrow widths of handlebars, whether that's female riders, whether that's smaller riders, juvenile riders, there are handlebar dimensions that are going to need to be, say, a 36 centimeter handlebar, or maybe even narrower, because the riders are just not that big. Now, that might fall outside the UCI current rulings, but I think that there will still be demand for those products because people will continue to use them and want them. Have
you seen any sort of data or justification published from the UCI for these changes?
No. Safety has been the main considerable factor. Specifically with, say, rider speeds in the peloton, with, say, rim depths. Most rims, though, are usually below the 65 millimeter. On the handlebar side of things, the suggestion is that the narrower handlebars were somehow less safe. However, there hasn't been any real data supplied that kind of indicates that that's the case, and there's a large amount of riders that are using narrow handlebars, as we see, and we see specifically with the teams that FSA and Vision supports. But there hasn't been any real data suggesting that a narrow handlebar is less safe maybe than a wider handlebar is.
Perhaps also maybe does it involve a cost implication as well? There's going to be more resource and cost involved, which potentially could end up being passed on to consumers. I don't know. You tell me.
I don't know if that cost would be passed down to consumers. I think you certainly would have to shift your priorities around, depending on what the company is, to meet with what the needs are. I think that production lead times and tooling lead times, just purely from the operational perspective, those take long enough that you're not going to be able to, you can't just pick up the phone and order 100 handlebars and have them show up tomorrow. I mean, that takes time. So those things are definitely impactful, but I think those are kind of after the fact of you've kind of gone through all those steps. Hey, we've created the right product. We've tested the product. We know it's safe. We know it's going to perform well. And then, how do we get this product to market? How do we get this product to the teams and the athletes? So to make a rule change that's 6 months away is very unrealistic and really is unachievable. And it can create some messy results, I think, in the end. Just from a timeline perspective, I think that there might be teams and riders that are going to find they're going to be without product. Just not that you would have something that would be unsafe that would be put into the market. I think what you're going to end up with is you just won't have product for certain sizes.
How do you understand it to be that using the height as the only parameter to limit wheel choice? Do you see that being a good thing, a bad thing? Because from my perspective, the rim height or depth is really only one piece of the puzzle, which impacts stability and safety from a wheel perspective.
Certainly, the depth is part of it. I mean, there's certainly as we see we see in races and with teams, riders are going to choose the best wheel for the application that they're in. So if they're in a mountain stage, they're looking for a lighter weight wheel. If they're, in a little bit of a rolling stage, they're looking for like a mid-depth aero performance, but also has competitive weight. And then with a relatively flat stage, for example, they're looking at like the deepest wheel that they could possibly use. But at the same time, there's a relationship between, say, rim depth and, say, steering torque and the ability to handle that wheel in the wind. And so definitely the teams are really going to self-select, and the riders are going to self-select which wheels are going to be kind of performing the best for them. Now, in our case, we put a lot of work on to the development side of things to make a selection of wheels that's going to perform well, depending on what the course is or what the needs are for that particular rider. And so while we've got everything from lightweight climbing wheels through mid-range wheels, and then all the way to, say, like a TT wheel with like a disc rear and a deep section front. Those are obviously for TTs only. But in the case of like the other wheel development, definitely the riders and the teams are pretty savvy about what to choose. But, looking at that just on the rim alone, the tire also affects that. Like the rolling resistance affects that. You look at, like, say, tire width. What does that affect both on the aerodynamic side of thing and also on the rolling resistance side of things? It doesn't, the rim itself doesn't operate completely in a silo. It's a complete system, both integrated with the bike and the rider as well. So while the front wheel sees 100% of the wind, no doubt about that, because it's on the leading edge, that rim depth is only one part of the equation. I think having the industry included with front side discussions, a year and a half to 2 years out about proposed rule changes, working together with the UCI, obviously looking to create the safest product possible, that it's going to perform at the highest levels, regardless of what the use is for that product. And being able to work not just on the technical side of things, but, what are the, how are the rules enforced? How can we help the UCI as to, what's an accurate way to measure a shifter on a handlebar, or what's the accurate way to measure tire width, inflated tire width, for example. And then how could we work together to make sure that the product that's delivered, not just to the teams and the riders, but to the general population itself, kind of meets within these regulations, and just make sure that the regulations are sound, not just in their, not just in what their goals are, but as to like what they are actually like indicating. And, do those dimensions make sense? Does that weight make sense? Is this something that's an achievable result? And then how can we work together with the UCI to make sure that that's a reality?
It was super interesting speaking to Mark about how the UCI consult with other organizations on their regulations, and it was super interesting to hear how this impacts manufacturers too. But since speaking to Mark, the UCI have then backtracked slightly and relaxed their regulations on handlebars, which is great news because it means that smaller riders can continue to use products most suited to them in racing. Now, while pro racing remains a tiny proportion of the number of cyclists around the world, those UCI regulations do still have a huge impact on the cycling industry as a whole, which I do think kind of seems like a slightly bonkers way for things to work. Now, I'm not entirely sure of a solution to this, but if you have any bright ideas, please share them in the comments section down below. So back to that original question, have the UCI lost control over pro racing? Well, in the world of road racing, I don't think so, but I think it is great to see them questioned and pushed to ultimately do the best job they can to make racing safer and ensure they're doing things in a fair manner. That court ruling by the Belgian Competition Authority will probably and hopefully serve as a brilliant example that the UCI don't always have the final say. But what about gravel racing, I hear you ask? Well, that is where it kind of feels like things hang in the balance a little bit when it comes to technical regulations and the UCI. They do have some element of control thanks to the introduction of the Gravel World Series and the UCI World Championships. But outside of that, gravel is almost a world of its own. You have standalone events or commercial race series that essentially create their own rules and regulations, and at the moment, they all seem to be thriving. For gravel, I think that's a good thing because I want to see it retain its raw and unique appeal to all sorts of riders rather than become too serious or be seen to becoming elitist. So there you go, a bit of a deep dive into the world of technical regulations, and quite the nerdy subject, I know, but very important, seeing as it will impact all of us in some way or another. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, please give it a thumbs up. And of course, to show your support for GCNTech, hit the subscribe button and turn on those notifications. Right, I'm out of here, see ya.